Good evening, Whiskey Club members. Welcome to the June edition of Eureka Whiskey Club virtual tasting. As always, coming to you here from my home bar. My bar is a little bit messy today, so doing it from my desk here. So you can see fun things like helium tanks here. I won't go into what I'm using that for, but fun stuff. I am very happy to be joined by Benny Hurwitz from Wild Turkey and Russell's and many other amazing whiskey brands. And we are going to be talking about mainly all things Wild Turkey, but also Russell's Reserve Private Barrel. That was in everyone's boxes this month. We will have a couple prizes to give away. We will be giving away 2 bottles. We will announce those at a later date. We're still trying to confirm what bottles are available, but I assure you they are going to be delicious. So obviously the first place will get something a little bit more highly allocated, and second place will get still a delicious bottle of whiskey as well. So as always, type out your comments or your questions if you're joining us from Facebook or YouTube. And we will try to get to as many questions as possible, and then we'll pick a couple winners. And obviously, we're going to drink some whiskey. Benny's going to make us a cocktail, and should be a fun call. So, Benny, please introduce yourself to our members.
Thanks, Trevor. What's up, everybody? I am Benny Hurwitz. I am one of our portfolio ambassadors for Wild Turkey Distillery. I've actually been with the brand for just over 5 years now. I've done one of these whiskey tastings with you all about a year ago. So not my first one, and certainly not my first virtual rodeo, as we all, I'm sure you can imagine. But, my primary function is traveling around the country, educating people on these brands and getting to taste this whiskey with great people. So excited to do that tonight.
Awesome. So I think, first of all, if you could just give us a little bit of history on the Wild Turkey brand. Obviously, I see you got the DSP KY67 shirt on. Just kind of walk us through the history of the distillery and how Wild Turkey came to be and how the Russell's brand came to be. And I know you probably talk about it for hours, but give us a short little short little snippet.
All right, I'll try to give you the short version. I mean, these are brands that are near and dear to me, and there certainly is a family behind them. Wild Turkey as a brand has been around since 1942, so just over 80 years now. But where we make the bourbon down in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, we've had a distillery on those grounds for over 150 years now. So it started with a family called the Rippies back before Prohibition. They had to close when that came around. And, it was actually their great-granddaughter down the line who would get back into the business, bring back their previous master distiller, and ended up right there pretty much on those same grounds, though the distillery was, rebuilt and new. And then nowadays, there's the Russell family at the helm. So Jimmy Russell, he actually started at Wild Turkey in 1954. So he was there when Olivia Rippey, the great-granddaughter of the original family, was still around. And it was almost like this, passing of the guard. And I'm sure you all know Jimmy Russell. Many of you that are tuned in right now, that's whose name's on the bottle of the whiskey that we're drinking tonight. But he's not alone. He's got his son and his grandson there working with him, helping him at the distillery. And like I said, Jimmy started there in 1954. At the time, he was only about 20, 21 years old. And Jimmy's going to be 90 this November. So he's been around the block. He knows a thing or two about bourbon. But above all, he's still alive and well and with us, working at the Wild Turkey Distillery, again, with his son and his grandson. So we have a rich history. The Russell's brand itself really didn't come around until the early 2000s, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But, Jimmy Russell, his son Eddie Russell, and now his grandson Bruce have essentially dedicated their lives, their family name, to making these products. So there really is this family, this lineage, this history behind the brands, not only with the people operating it now, but our actual distillery grounds. If you get a chance to come down to Kentucky, most people go to Louisville or Lexington. We're a short drive from either one. And if you come to Wild Turkey Distillery, you really get that sense of history there firsthand. We're right over the Kentucky River. We've got a really old warehouse that's also over 100 years old, built in the 1890s, that still houses barrels that go into these products. In fact, I'm not sure all the barrels that you guys got because you pick a bunch for these tastings, but one could very well be from Rickhouse A, that we keep 10 to 12,000 barrels in there a year, and it's a 130-year-old warehouse. So again, just history. We're full and rich with it. We have a family behind these brands, and the way we make these products is really special too.
I have all the bottles here. I was looking for Warehouse A.
I'm jealous, but I got a little single barrel here myself. So yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about the Russell's whiskey in general? This specifically, the single barrel. Like, what's the mash bill? Kind of what goes. Talk to us about the non-chill filtration and what that does for the whiskey, and kind of just give us a synopsis of the whiskey that everyone got this month.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to talk about Russell's and to talk about the single barrel that we're tasting tonight, we kind of have to pull it back to just how we make our whiskey in general. Because one of the things that's really unique about the Wild Turkey Distillery is that we make a dozen different expressions from 2 mash bills. One of those is bourbon and one of those is rye. So that means every Wild Turkey or Russell's Reserve bourbon that you drink, as well as every Wild Turkey Russell's Reserve rye whiskey that you can buy and enjoy, right? Each of those just derives from the same recipe. So because we're live on Facebook and YouTube, I know that Jimmy he still doesn't like to tell the mash bill, but what I'll tell you is that number one, we actually use all non-GMO grains, which really just applies to the corn, right? But that is something that's really important to Jimmy still, is that non-GMO corn. And I can also tell you that we use over 70% corn. Rye is our secondary grain, and we also use over 10% barley. So it's a very traditional mash bill, as I would describe it, meaning high in corn and almost equal in rye and barley. But the quality of the grains is really important to us. That's where that non-GMO factor comes in. All of our corn is grown in the U.S., in Kentucky and Indiana. Our barleys come from the Dakotas and Montana, gets malted in Milwaukee. And then our rye grain, the majority of it actually comes from Europe. So for us, again, it's about the quality of the grain. And, we grow a lot of barley here. We make a lot of beer here. We grow a lot of corn here. Corn is a huge food source, right? But rye, not as big in the U.S. So we actually go to the countries that eat the most rye grain to get the best quality rye. So then those 3 grains are going to come together, and that's going to make both our bourbon and our rye mash bill.
So where's that come from? What countries?
Germany, Belarus, Poland, that whole region.
Nice.
A lot of places where rye is part of the culture, just like we primarily eat white bread. They eat rye bread, and there's all different types of it as well. So, they grow the grains well. They grow them for food quality, whereas still we use a lot of rye for maybe feed or cover crops and things like that. So back to kind of what I was saying and getting at with Russell's and what we're tasting tonight is, again, that all these products are made the same way. So if you're a fan of Wild Turkey, you may know this, right? If you like Wild Turkey 101, or maybe you don't, maybe you haven't had it in a while, it would be really cool to revisit something like that after you enjoy the Russell's Reserve single barrel tonight. Now, knowing that there's really never any corners cut in any of our products. They're all made from the same mash bill, same yeast, same place, same process, same type of barrel. It's all about the age, the batch size, the barrel selection, and the proof that really make these whiskeys unique. Where they age in those warehouses, what floor, what rick, the center, near the side, how the weather affects or the temperatures affect that warehouse and that floor, all play a role during the aging. So for us, it's about, controlling it on the front end, only making it one way, and letting the aging process, the maturation stage, develop the different flavors in different barrels. And then when we talk about batch sizes, right? Is it 1,000 barrels mixed together? Is it 100 barrels mixed together? Or is it one single barrel like we're tasting tonight? So when you get down to those single barrel expressions, those barrels have to be special. They have to taste right. They have to meet a unique profile, especially when we're talking about the private select barrels. We want those to be a little bit different than your everyday Russells and Wild Turkey. So I can't exactly speak to the tasting notes because I know we have probably 8 different barrels out there between all the different viewers, upwards of at least
9.
and 9 this year. So that's great. That means the group's growing. So but yeah, I can't speak to the exact flavor profile of your barrel that you might have at home with you right now, because not all of you have the same one. But what I can tell you is that with our products, you're going to get a lot of those really classic inherent bourbon flavors, the caramel, the vanilla, the baking spice, like cinnamon and clove, and definitely lots of oak. Our Russell's Reserve single barrels average about at 9 years old. So that is a very, very well-aged bourbon. Remember, age and maturity are 2 different things, as we learned growing up, right? Age is, in terms of whiskey, age is the literal number of years that it was sitting in that barrel, versus maturity is when that barrel's ready, when we're selecting it. And that could be for different things in different products. And maturity also means different things in different spirit categories and in different places around the world, right? So a mature scotch and a mature bourbon could be at 2 different ages based on barrels and climates, right? So a good mature bourbon is typically around 6 to 8 years old. So at 9 years old, we're above that threshold of where it's just getting good. And this is where it's really starting to get complex. So I don't know if people are tasting yet or what we're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I am. I had a question about the rick houses or the different warehouses. Now, how many of them do you have? I know you said the oldest one is warehouse A, and that's you close over 100 years old.
Yep, well over 100. It was built in 1894.
Oh wow!
So it's
how many warehouses are there total? And I guess what's the newest of the warehouses? And I know our members have a lot of interest in where the whiskey came from. I think we have only 2 warehouses total. One is Camp Nelson. Is there only one Camp Nelson, or is there 2? I can't remember.
There's actually 5 warehouses over there.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, so I can get into that.
Yeah, please do.
So we've got about, I want to say we're going on 31 warehouses in total, and that's across 3 locations. But, they're not necessarily really far apart or that different, and they're definitely not too different in their environment in terms of warehouse construction as well as, the climate. The furthest our warehouses are away from each other is about 30 miles. And at Wild Turkey Distillery, which we call Tyrone, which is in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, Anderson County. And we call it Tyrone because that's the original name that the town was given by some of the Irish settlers, named for Tyrone, Ireland. So we still call that area Tyrone when we're referring to it in terms of, aging location. So at Tyrone, where our distillery is, we've got about 21 warehouses. Then we have another place in Lawrenceburg that's actually just only about 10 miles away. We call that McBrayer. And that's another little town. That's going to be actually right next to Four Roses Distillery, believe it or not. So they're our neighbor. If you've ever, visited Lawrenceburg or visited Four Roses and you see a couple warehouses across the street, those are actually Wild Turkey warehouses. So we've got 3 over there, but I believe we have 4 over there and we use 3 of them. And then The furthest is the Camp Nelson, which I was referring to earlier, which is one of the barrels, or maybe both. Did you say both of your barrels are Camp Nelson, or one is Camp Nelson and one is some Tyrone, maybe?
Well, there's 9 of them.
Right.
So it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them are Camp Nelson, and then 3 of them are Tyrone.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, those are going to be the 2 locations we're focusing on. And, just to kind of round it out again with McBrayer, that's by Four Roses. We have 3 warehouses we use over there, and you rarely see stuff from that in the barrel program. Camp Nelson, on the other hand, as well as Tyrone, our main location and distillery site, that's where the majority of the barrels are coming from, because that's where the majority of our warehouses are, right? So Tyrone, 21 warehouses. Camp Nelson, we currently have 5. And I say currently because we used to have 6. We actually had to tear one down last year or the year before. It was just kind of getting compromised, the structure of it. So they pulled it down and were able to move out the barrels before, something worse happened and we lost a lot of great aging bourbon. So we currently have 5 over there. And those are going to be A, B, D, E, F. It skips C because that's the one that was taken down. And then over at Tyrone, they go A through X, but it also skips a few. J, L, and I have all been either taken down in the past or, I think they were all taken down either when we built our new distillery or when one of those ones, I believe, was also kind of compromised at one point. So that's why they're A through X, but we only have 21 over there because it skips 3. But really, at the end of the day, the majority of the rick houses are built the same way, whether it was built in 1894 or 2020. We're still building warehouses, and we do clad metal siding. We do, exposed dirt floors, and we do wooden ricks. So timber ricks, very old school. Along the way, over the years, we did add a couple palletized warehouses because those allow us to maximize capacity. So what we'll do is some of those warehouses will send some of that liquid to, American honey or some of our RTD drinks we do in Australia.
Now, what is your thought on, I know you said the warehouses are built very similarly, but I think a lot of people have preferences when it comes to, what if it's Tyrone or Camp Nelson or McBrayer. 1, do you have a preference? And 2, why do you think people have preferences between the 3?
Yeah, I mean, so all tasting is subjective, of course, right? But Camp Nelson has gotten a little bit of a cool reputation in recent years. And I mean, honestly, before probably 4 or 5 years ago at most, people didn't know it existed. What I didn't mention about Camp Nelson is it sits across the street from an old military graveyard. And that's where it also gets its name, Camp Nelson. I believe there was a battle fought there. So it's got this kind of allure and kind of interesting story to it. The warehouses are probably from the 50s or 60s. And then some of the other products that we've made where Camp Nelson barrels have gone into, like some of our really limited edition Russells 2002 and 2003, which were vintage age stated 15 and 16-year-old, really small batches. Those came from Camp Nelson. So people kind of gravitated toward it once they knew we were using it in special products. And then as it got into the barrel program, it just got known for having kind of, some people would describe it as the Camp Nelson prickle. It's just got this little spice and this kick that people really enjoy. I think with our Tyrone warehouses, they actually vary more in flavor. So, depending on which warehouse it is, they could taste pretty different.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a preference. I mean, I think every barrel is different, and depending on where it's aged in the warehouse and so on and so forth. But I have heard from
Oh no.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Sorry, I lost you for a sec.
Yeah, I think I lost. It might be my internet connection. No, I just was curious on your take because we have heard from quite a few members about can I get a Camp Nelson bottle, and I was like, you have a six out of 9 chance of getting one. So
Right.
but the Tyrone stuff is amazing as well.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to pick favorites. I'm fortunate that I get to enjoy a lot of different stuff from our distillery. But I am drawn towards some of our older warehouses back at the distillery on Tyrone. The warehouse B and the warehouse D, just in the past, we've had those in our program. And those are some of the ones that just kind of just stick out in my memory. I like my bourbon to be kind of like rich and sweet. I like it a little bit oaky, but I like it a little bit fruity. You're probably all just nodding your head like, yeah, that's just a really good bourbon is what that sounds like. And you're not wrong, but it's more so that balance of flavor is what I'm looking for.
Yeah. And I think that, I think that represents Russell's in general. And you have those classic bourbon notes. It has a nice fruit characteristic, and the oak is there, but it's not, overpowering. Before we get into kind of talking about tasting notes here, I was curious, why on the single barrel program do you guys not do cast strength releases, or do you? Because I know all these, I know 110 proof is essentially cast strength, but a lot of the barrels, are 115, 125, so on and so forth. Is there a reasoning behind not bottling these picks at cast strength?
To be totally honest, I don't know the exact reason. I could probably give you a few reasons and things that I think might be the case. Number one, really just being where we are in bourbon now is not where we were 5 years ago, and especially not 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And even beyond that, of course, right? So we have to recall the times when bourbon wasn't so popular, and a lot of the things that we would do to just, standardize the product, make it a little more approachable, right? This also kind of goes back to chill filtration. Why isn't it chill? Why isn't everything non-chill filtered, right? But a lot of these practices are grandfathered in. So when we created Russell's single barrel over a decade ago, people still weren't really keen to what barrel proof bourbon was. So for us to fully take this leap and change this to a barrel proof product, yes, that's going to really, really appease the 2,000 to 4,000 bourbon geeks out there. But you got to think about the hundreds of thousands of everyday bourbon folks that will be really confused by that still. So for us, and this is just me kind of speaking transparently what I think. This isn't necessarily like a company statement. It just takes time to make those type of changes to where the broader audience is going to understand it. But that said, we are working towards that type of stuff. We have come out with more non-chill filtered and more barrel proof offerings, like with Rare Breed Rye, and a lot of our Master's Keep stuff is typically non-chill filtered and higher proof now. But the private barrel program still. And then my other answer, that's a little more of the fun answer, is I like to say, Jimmy Russell, this guy's been making wild turkey for almost 70 years. He doesn't even really change much, period. That's why we only still have one mash bill for all of our bourbons and all of our ryes respectively, right? So for him, he doesn't want to do anything to compromise the product. And even in that case is sometimes, him just having a little control over it. And what I would say in terms of just our regular single barrel offerings, like Russell's Reserve or Kentucky Spirit, both of them have water added. That gives us that control that Jimmy likes, that consistency that Jimmy likes. If every barrel, again, back to the Whiskey Geeks, shout out to you guys. right? We would love every barrel to be barrel proof and be completely different. But Jimmy is, in a way, a little afraid of that. He likes his control, his consistency, even though we know every barrel is unique. By adding that little bit of water and getting it to 110, lets us know we know it's still going to meet the Russell's kind of flavor standard and profile. That's in terms of our normal products. So then in terms of the private barrels, it's really just working our way towards that. And there's a lot of other corporate higher up people and marketing people that have to sign off on this stuff. It's not just the Russell family that can make these decisions. So, and it's certainly not me.
I got a couple more questions for you, then we'll get into tasting, and then you're going to make a cocktail, I believe.
Yeah.
So my wife and I like to go to thrift stores, and I collect tiki mugs, like vintage tiki mugs, and I feel like every thrift store I go into, I see these vintage wild turkey bottles of like different events and Olympics and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about the history behind that, and if that's ever going to make a comeback? Or are you guys going to start coming out with new ceramic bottles for things again? Or I just feel like every thrift store I go into, I see a wild turkey like commemorative bottle of something.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. That was not just us either. All the big producers during, probably late 70s, all the way up into probably 1990, decanters were huge, right? So that same time period, what wasn't so huge was bourbon. So really what it was, again, back to kind of marketing, it was a way to showcase different holidays, events, sporting things. And in the case of wild turkey, we did multiple series around turkeys, wildlife, lore. There was all these different series. I'm sure at this point you've probably seen some of those old decanters where it's literally like a turkey with a little family of raccoons, or like a turkey and an eagle. There was a whole series dedicated to like turkeys and other wildlife. Like we had all this stuff. And again, really just, a way to try to sell this bourbon that wasn't super popular at a time. It was still the same way we're making it now, more or less. Same quality ingredients. We never really compromised or changed the way we made wild turkey. It's just now people are more interested in bourbon, and all sorts of different types of, bourbons, rye, whiskeys in general. But back then it wasn't. It was kind of fizzling. Bourbon's real first heyday post-prohibition was the 50s and 60s, but by the 70s it was starting to fade to other spirits. And really, again, that's where those decanters kind of came in as a marketing tactic to sell these commemorative and different editions, collaborations. I think I've seen one where we did that was like with Mack trucks, like the 18-wheeler trucks. So it had the bulldog on top, which was really cool. But it was all of those decanters were 8-year-old 101 wild turkey. They were all the same liquid, just over 20 years of different bottles, which is really cool. As far as that stuff coming back today, you might see some nods to the past coming from us in the next couple years. We're working on some cool things, but I don't think it's going to be any decanters. One of the big things about those that people talk about in the ceramic and the other material they were made out of is possible lead poisoning, or lead that can get into the whiskey. My understanding with that is, as long as you don't drink a whole bottle of it with your friends in one night, you'll probably be okay to just try it. So if you do find one of those old bottles with whiskey in it, just be a little weary. They can be hit or miss. So I know we're kind of speaking to seeing empty decanters in thrift shops and things like that. But every once in a while, you might come across one with whiskey in it, and it could either be really good or really bad. The corks on those things weren't the best either. So there's a lot of variables that can come about.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a full one. I just didn't know the story behind it, but I think it would be kind of cool to like have something come out. We get paid homage to that a little bit.
So we did. I actually have a thing here, but it was a very, very small run. And actually, I think I have some. I put my own whiskey in it. But we
nice.
did this. We did this a couple years ago, just at our visitor center down in Kentucky. So
That's cool.
you know, you would have had to been stopping by, and you could have picked one of these up. But it just comes empty, and then you can put your favorite wild turkey in
That's
it.
So cool.
But
I like that.
I really don't know what I put in mine. I can't remember. I have to try that next.
Cool. So I want to taste the whiskey. Obviously, I'm not going to taste all 9 here. But obviously my tasting notes are here. This was kind of what I had put together from just tasting through all of them over the series of a couple weeks, and kind of just picked my favorite tasting notes. So as always, if you've been a member for a while, sometimes I like to get pretty specific with my tasting notes. So on the nose here, I have vanilla, and one of my favorite tasting or nose of all time is my grandma's walnut bowl. Because my grandma, when I was a kid, had a bowl of walnuts always and it was a wooden bowl, had a bowl of walnuts in her living room. And every time we went over there, we'd get to crack a walnut and eat it. And on one of the barrels, it smelled exactly like my grandma's walnut bowl. And I was like, kind of blew my mind. So I was like, I have to put that on there. But obviously we have brown sugar and cinnamon on a lot here. Taste again, like some walnuts, some of that oak, English toffee, a little bit of black cherry, some fruitiness. And then the obviously being 110 proof or finish here is going to be pretty long and lingering with notes of sweet spice and oak. But curious on if you're in the chat, obviously we have 9 different barrels here. So feel free to type in what barrel you have and what tasting notes you get, and kind of bounce it off the other members in the chat tonight. Let's see, Brendan Franco says he's got some cream soda on the nose. So yeah, if you're tasting this whiskey, feel free to throw your tasting notes and your what you're smelling out there. As far as like the one, I don't want to say I like them all. I will say I finished a few quicker than the others. The one I'm tasting today, the bottle I got was the Camp Nelson 4-5 Warehouse E, which just happened to be also one of the bottles I finished. So it's safe to say that was one of my favorites. But yeah, Benny, I mean, I know you're probably, I don't think you have any of these bottles, but I mean, what are some of your favorite tasting notes or nose notes off of Russell's picks in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, I am actually tasting a pick right now from another buddy of mine, just so I could drink along with you guys. But just in terms of Russell's, I think some of the stuff you said already kind of just it nails in a good way, because you have 9 different barrels. It nails like a good classic Russell's profile down. The dark cherry really resonates with me. Of course, the cinnamon, the toffee, butterscotch, caramel, whatever you want to call it in that realm, and the vanilla. If it's, creme brulee, vanilla bean, marshmallow, it can come off a lot of different ways. In what I'm tasting right now, again, completely different barrel, but I'm also getting like orange peel a lot. I'm getting a lot of the nuttiness that you were also referring to, the pecan or walnut for sure. Maybe a little bit of like cacao or chocolatey kind of notes, not like a sweet, but like a bitter kind of chocolate. But the caramel, the oakiness, the char, almost like a little leathery as well, is something you can get. Tobacco spice is another note. It's kind of sweet and spicy at once together. But those are definitely some other things that you may or may not taste and smell in those great whiskeys you have in front of you.
Awesome. Would you mind mixing up a drink really quick of the recipe that we have here, which is a Boulevardier?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me grab some ice. I've got it ready, and I'll be right back.
Cool. Brendan Franco also says he's getting some vanilla cherry Coke, which I can definitely definitely see. And then Sean Tallman is saying cinnamon, cherry, brown sugar, well integrated oak, excellent. Yeah. So
Yeah,
hopefully you guys like
I think that that cherry note, I really liked we're hearing that too, because that's something I do talk about a lot. Even just in our everyday Russell's Reserve 10-year-old bourbon. So I know a lot of y'all are probably know some of our other products, but we have a standard small batch Russell's Reserve. It's a 10-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon. It's 90 proof, so it's like a little more approachable in terms of ABV, as kind of say a daily drinker, if you will, or something that you might keep around the house, or share with your friends that aren't necessarily used to the higher proof stuff. But in that 10-year-old, one of the notes I always get from everybody is cherry, and it's either marzipan, amaretto, cherry coke, dark cherry, you name it. I've heard pretty much everything at this point. So awesome.
Yeah, I mean, and if you haven't had the Russell's 10-year, every Eureka restaurant has it available on our list. Makes a great old fashioned. And if you hadn't had the Russell's 10-year, next time you're in Eureka, go get a pour. It's a phenomenal whiskey.
Awesome. I agree. So you all got your tasting note card with all the information on it, some of those great notes about your barrels and whatnot. And there should also be a cocktail recipe in there. That recipe is the Boulevardier. I think it's a classic a lot of y'all would be familiar with at this point. One of the most popular drinks in the entire world right now is the Negroni, gin, Campari, and sweet vermouth. So if you know the Negroni, you should know the Boulevardier, because simply it is a bourbon Negroni, right? The Boulevardier actually goes back all the way to 1927. It was created in Paris during Prohibition for us, and it combines bourbon with Campari and sweet vermouth. So an American ingredient, 2 Italian ingredients, created in France during Prohibition. Sounds like a good drink to me. It is a spirit-forward drink, so meaning it is all spirit-based. There isn't any citrus or syrups, anything like that. We're using vermouth, which is an aromatized wine. We're using Campari, which is an Amaro or, aperitivo, the nice red bitter stuff. And what I love about this cocktail, number one, is the flavor, the complexity. It's a drink that if you've never had it before, you might have to have it a couple times before you get used to it. But bitter flavors are super popular now. I'm sure y'all enjoy IPA beers or gin and tonics, even different leafy greens and vegetables that are really popular now that weren't as popular 10, 20 years ago, right? A lot of these more bitter, complex flavors are really, really tasty. And this cocktail kind of hits on all of that. So again, it's really easy to make. That's because it's equal parts. You can make it as big or as small as you want, as long as you're using equal parts of each ingredient. That said, you could even make it in a large batch and put it in a bottle and share it with friends at a cocktail party, which is really cool. You could fancy it up, put a little ribbon on it, and bring it to somebody's house and look like a mixologist. So we're going to build it in the glass. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way. So first, I'm going to grab my mixing glass. Got this little beaker situation, and again, it's equal parts. I'm just making one serving, so I'm going to simply use 1 ounce of each. So I'm starting with that Campari, 1 ounce.
And Benny, one of the things I like to do with my Boulevardiers is I love Campari, obviously, but using a different type of like a split base Amaro. One thing I've been doing is using Cynar with half Cynar, half Montenegro to replace the Campari, and with sweet vermouth and using a rye whiskey. Just if you're looking to fancy up the recipe a little bit, that's something I've been doing recently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we talk about what we call the Negroni family tree all the time. And that, there's a lot of drinks that riff off the Negroni, not just the Boulevardier, You know, there's also the Old Pal, which is a rye whiskey variation. There's, you know, the Oaxacan Negroni where you use mezcal, the Kingston Negroni where you use Jamaican rum. So there's a lot of really fun ways to play on this cocktail. All right, so we got our Campari. Now we're going to do our sweet vermouth. What was that, Trevor?
I was going to say we're working on a new Italian, it's an Italian kind of a Mediterranean Brazil. It's like a higher end concept we're working on. We're opening up in Miami and San Diego in a few months, and I've been playing around with very, very many Negroni riffs. It's a fun.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, like I said, I'm not exaggerating. Statistically, the Negroni was the #1 cocktail in the world last year. I'm not sure if that's changed, but people know about it now. So it's really, really common to see not only classic Negronis, but to your point, variations or unique twists on this drink because, you know, not only are the flavors trending, you know, the awareness of this drink is there now. All right, so last but not least, that Russell's Reserve single barrel. What's really great about this cocktail and using the Russells in it is that whether you are using the single barrel that you have tonight, or if you're using our 10-year-old bourbon, both of those options are well-aged bourbons. Because we're putting bourbon up against something like Campari and sweet vermouth, two ingredients that are already very flavorful on their own, we're going to need a bourbon that can also hold its own. So in the case of this, right, we've got about a 9-year-old bourbon. And you all at home, if you're making this drink or if you're just looking at your bottle, you can actually look at the dates and see when it was barreled and when it was dumped. And it should even actually have the age listed below it. I have a slightly older one that doesn't tell you the age, so I have to do the math. But as you can see, most of your barrels are probably going to be 9 years old. And whether you're using that or our standard 10-year-old, you're getting that big, bold, oaky, wild turkey profile where 1 ounce of bourbon is going to be just enough for the 1 ounce of Campari and 1 ounce of vermouth. Equal parts, again, is the easiest way to make this drink, but it doesn't mean you can't add a little more bourbon if you like it that way. All right, so now I need some ice. I try not to shy on ice. I like my drinks cold, you know. Sometimes people think a little too much ice in a drink means they're not getting enough booze, right? But it's about a balance. One of the most important ingredients in every single cocktail is water, right? The water that we're getting when we're shaking or stirring or just simply pouring over. That ice is adding water to our spirits and as they integrate, and it's lending balance, right? It's helping meld the flavors. So too much ice, I don't think there is such a thing, right? As long as your drink is measured as well, then you know how much alcohol you're getting. So a cold drink, I think, is #1 for me, and properly diluted as well is important. All right, so really I just tell you that while I'm stirring to distract you. So I like this drink nice and cold. And since I've stirred it separately, I've now captured the appropriate amount of dilution that I'm desiring. So again, this drink is balanced. It's not too strong. And I'm going to pour it over a larger ice cube. Now, because this large ice cube actually has less surface area than all these small little cubes do in here, right? Where the liquid can kind of mingle in between all the cracks. Here now it's just can only touch the sides. So because I've chilled and diluted here, strain it over the big cube, that big cube now is slowing down the melting process and I can kind of enjoy my drink over time. Last but not least, got to do an orange peel. I'm actually using a clementine. That's all I've got right now.
We've all been there.
All right, then we're going to hit this over the top. You know, these citrus peels are full of these great oils. Get that on top. Smells great, nice and orangey. And that's the Boulevardier. Russell's Reserve Bourbon, Campari Sweet Vermouth, equal parts. Stir it, strain it over a cube. Ah, perfect.
Thank you very much for walking us through that. Boulevardier is one of my favorites. So if you're able to make that cocktail at home, you never had it before, enjoy. I think the single barrel goes perfect with it. So Benny, I want to get to questions now. Again, we got a couple bottles that we're going to be giving away that will be announced to the winners at a later date. We promise they'll be good bottles. I don't want to say what one of them will be, but I promise you it's going to be good if we're able to get it. But let's dive into the questions. So Clark White wants to know, what's your favorite Jimmy story?
Yeah, so love this question, of course. I mean, Jimmy is a wealth of knowledge, right? But he's also kind of like a jokester. He's also super modest. I mean, the guy drove the same 1995 Ford Ranger pickup truck to work for 30 years until it broke down like 2 years ago.
That's amazing.
Partially because he was burning the clutch, but that's neither here nor there. But Jimmy, he's just a down-to-earth guy. Like, if you've ever seen any videos or interviews of him, like, you can pretty much pick that up right away. He likes to say, "I'm just Jimmy from Kentucky." He doesn't really like to harp on the fact that he's been making wild turkey for almost 70 years. And so, he's a legend, but he's cool. And I've got to spend a lot of time around him over the years. Even prior to working for Wild Turkey, I would visit the distillery as a bartender because I was just super into wild turkey. And, over my visits and learning about the distillery and the warehouses, one of the things that I had found unique as I learned, not everybody does it this way, but remember, a lot of our warehouses are super old. So that means they don't have HVAC, there's no heat, there's no AC, but that's how they're meant to be. Having no climate control in our warehouses is what allows our barrels to kind of age based on nature and temperature and climate, right? So one day I'm down in Wild Turkey and I'm actually there with a big group of bartenders. I'd been a couple times. I'd learned a lot of stuff. And, I was maybe trying to impress some of my friends. And Jimmy was sitting there in it, like basically in a rocking chair on the front porch of this warehouse. Remember, this warehouse is 130 years old. Jimmy's just like a legend. And I'm kind of trying to show off to my friends. And I'm just like, yeah, so this is our oldest warehouse. It's been here 100 and something years. And none of these warehouses are temperature controlled because, we like to see, let nature take its course during the ages. But right as I said, none of these warehouses are temperature controlled. Jimmy cuts me off super abruptly, nearly like shouts at me. And he's like, "Well, yeah, they are." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I've been saying this wrong the whole time. I've been telling everybody the wrong stuff. They are temperature controlled. I've never seen it. I don't know what he's talking about." And he goes, "You can open the windows, can't you?" And that was his version of temperature control. It's like, you can open the windows, can't you? So that's a good Jimmy one. That was one where he really made me nervous early on, over 5 years ago at this point. But I've spent a lot of time with the Russells. I'm really close with Bruce Russell, who's one of my best friends. I've stayed at his childhood house, at his, Eddie Russell's house. I've slept on the couch and hung out with them. And, it's just awesome when you're just hanging out watching The Price is Right with Judy Russell and hanging out in the living room. It's just such a unique feeling. You feel really the family vibe of it. And, these guys are going to work every day at Wild Turkey, but to them, it's not really work. And especially to Jimmy, there's a reason that he's been there for going on 69 years, the better part of 7 decades. And to him, he'll tell you it's not work. He likes to say the day it's work starts being work, he'll stop showing up. So, just to kind of show you how special they are in the way they think and, the way they love the brand and the product that they make.
That's awesome. Brendan Franco wants to know if, Wild Turkey or Russell's has thought about any finishing techniques, that being such a popular thing these days in the whiskey community.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely, we think about all sorts of innovations all the time. We actually have teams that work on that with the Russell family, as well as the Campari company and the global team that does also make a lot of those decisions and sees what's going on in the market and a lot of the other trends. And we have, in fact, done a finished bourbon. We've done a couple technically. The first one we ever did was back in the early 2000s. It was a 10-year-old wild turkey. It was about 86 or 90 proof, and it was called Sherry Signature. And we put it in Oloroso sherry barrels. And that was, again, I would say 2005 at the most recent, long before the other finished bourbons had really taken off. You know, in terms of finishing whiskey, it's actually still a relatively new idea in the grand scheme, considering single malt scotches have been around. Some of these distilleries have been around for over 200 years. It wasn't until the mid 80s when one of the single malts started doing finishing. You know, they've always used sherry barrels or rum barrels or bourbon barrels or cognac barrels, new or used European and American oak, but taking the liquid from one barrel and putting it in another barrel for that finishing process didn't really start till the 80s in the way that it's marketed today. So then fast forward to American whiskey, it's an even newer concept. So we did it back in 2005 with a sherry bourbon. Then we came out in 2008 with a callback to that called Revival, where we then upped it. We took it up a notch. We used 12 to 15-year-old wild turkey. That was bottled at 101 proof, our classic. And that was finished in Oloroso sherry casks for about 2 months. So we have done finishing. We've also done a toasted oak finish. But for us, a lot of these finished products, they're typically going to be one-offs. But with that, you're going to find that we are using more exceptional liquid, right? So where some of the other producers out there that might offer a sherry finished bourbon or a port finished bourbon as their everyday product, you know, they're using 5-6-year-old bourbon at best. When we do something like that, we're going to be using 8, 9, 10, 12, 15-year-old bourbon, and we're going to be doing it kind of as a one-off. I don't necessarily see us adding a sherry or a port finish wild turkey to our everyday line.
Good to know.
Yeah, but we have done it.
So Mike Stodinger asks, how is the Russell's brand different from Rare Breed? What makes them different?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a really great question. I like that question because it should be an obvious question, but a lot of people miss it, right? Because we use one mash bill, one yeast strain, it's made at one place, one distillery, one set of stills, all the way down to the barrel. We use American white oak, number 4 char. None of that changes. So it is a really good question to ask, well, what makes it different? So with all of our products, the primary things that are going to make them different are going to be the age, the barrel selection. So is it from the top floor, the bottom floor, the middle floor? The batch size. Is it a large batch, a small batch? Is it a single barrel? And then lastly, the bottling proof. How much water did we add to it? Because as many of y'all know, bourbon by law, Kentucky straight bourbon, any bourbon for that matter, any straight bourbon cannot have anything added to it except for water after it's been aged. So even, just back to finishing bourbons, that technically changes them from being a straight bourbon. We won't get into all that right now, but by law, you can only add bourbon or water to your bourbon after you've aged it. So water is a huge tool. Is it 80 proof? Is it 101 proof? Is it 90 proof? Is it 110? Is it 116? The amount of water we add dictates the ABV, but it also changes the flavors immensely. So does the age. Is it a 6-year-old? Is it a 7-year-old, 8-year-old? Is it a 12-year-old? Is it a 15 or 17-year-old? The age is probably the most obvious because the longer something sits in the wood, the more concentrated it becomes and the more time it has to extract flavor and evolve. So age and water are huge, but then, don't sell short the batch size. mixing 1,000 barrels together versus 100 barrels, those 100 barrels, you have to be a lot more selective. And then, of course, when we get down to these single barrels, like we're talking about today, that's when you have to be the most selective. So now to answer your question, Mike, is that in the case of what we're drinking tonight, this is a 9-year-old single barrel bottled at 110 proof. It's non-chill filtered, whereas a rare breed bourbon is a combination of 6, 8, and 12-year-old barrels, plural, because we're actually mixing together about 150 barrels to make that product. So it's not just one. And the age ranges 6, 8, and 12. So not everything in between, but specifically 6, 8, and 12, technically making that a 6-year-old bourbon. And then where our Russell single barrel is diluted to 110 proof, it has a little bit of water added. Rare breed is barrel proof. So that means no water added. That is uncut. We are, by mixing together 6, 8, and 12-year-old barrels from different floors, we are essentially diluting whiskey with whiskey, but we don't add any water to that. So age, barrel selection, batch size, and proof is what makes all of our products different from each other, not just Russell's and Rare Breed.
Well, that explains.
And I mean, that explains it. But, you know, we're not alone, right? We just do it from one mash bill. A lot of our big competitors, they still utilize those techniques, age, barrel selection, batch size, and proof, but they also might have 2 or 3, 4 mash bills. They might have 5 yeast strains, like a place like Four Roses has 5 different yeast strains. So they do more variations on the front end, but they can still find variations through maturation, whereas we only get our variations during maturation.
So we got a couple questions about prohibition here. Mark Valpreda wants to know, any of the family members moonshiners during prohibition or would admit to it? And then Linda Archer wants to know if Jimmy remembers anything about prohibition. I'm sure he was very young. And did they keep distilling during prohibition? Again, essentially the same question as Mark.
Yeah, no, great questions. They're all kind of in the same realm. So Jimmy was born in 34. So that was the year after Prohibition ended. So growing up, you know, especially in Kentucky, where I'm sure plenty of people were making moonshine and people were still legally making bourbon for medicinal purposes, our distillery was not. Our distillery was shuttered. They were not granted a license to produce during Prohibition. But that's not to say, like, you know, whereas, you know, somebody may be born 10 years before and grew up, and by 10 years old, Prohibition's ending, they're going to have a completely different perspective. I think Jimmy still, he was born at a time right after to where he came up where, you know, alcohol was normal again. So I haven't really heard too many stories about that. You know, he didn't really come to age probably until the early 50s. So by then, people were drinking plenty. Not to, you know, say they weren't drinking plenty during Prohibition, but what I can tell you is that prior to Jimmy, my understanding that they did have other family members have worked in the whiskey industry. His father, and then even his wife, Joretta Russell, worked at Wild Turkey before Jimmy did. She's the one that actually got him the job. So, you know, they do have family ties to whiskey, of course, being from Kentucky for many generations, but I wouldn't say they were necessarily moonshiners.
I got a couple more questions here.
Yeah.
So Michael Lee wants to know how you guys treat your water at the distillery.
So our water,
You do treat
what's cool? Yes, we do. We do, yeah. And most people do. I would say probably everybody. You know, consistency is key in these products, and you know we have a lot of more control over that. So we're going to take advantage of that, and we have been for many years and even decades at this point. We sit right over the Kentucky River, So where our distillery is, and there has been a distillery for over 150 so years now, they would have pulled right from the river. There wouldn't have been any other fancy filtration back then besides to maybe get, any other debris, rocks or gravel, mud, something like that out, right? But what we know about Kentucky is that it sits on top of limestone rock. So naturally, our water, as it percolates up through the earth into the streams and rivers, limestone filters out iron and enriches the water with calcium, magnesium, other minerals. It's essentially hard water, but it's good water for making spirits. Nowadays, right across the street from us, in fact, is a water treatment plant. So that water's coming out of the river. It's going through a city plant and it's getting treated. But then as it comes into our facility, we use reverse osmosis filtration. So we're using, at that point, purified water. We're not relying on Kentucky limestone or even the city. We are further purifying on site.
Cool. I got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll pick some winners here. Joshua Noel wants to know, can you tell us more about your collaboration with Rare Character, the pride of Anderson County?
Oh, okay. So this is a little more of a deep cut, if you will, for those who don't know. So
what are you and Pablo doing together?
Yeah, right. So yeah, that's it. Pablo's one of our buddies, and David Jennings. If you all aren't familiar, there's a gentleman in South Carolina. He's literally the biggest wild turkey fan in the world. Actually, you know what? He'd probably tell you there's another guy that's even bigger fan than him, named David James in upstate New York. But we'll give Rarebird some credit. So David Jennings, he goes by Rarebird101 on Instagram. He also has a website and a blog he's been doing for about 7 years, fully dedicated to wild turkey. So this guy, when I say he's a super fan, he's one of a kind. And he's amazing. He's a friend of mine. He partnered with another gentleman who has an independent bottling company that does a series called Rare Character. So they source their barrels from different distilleries, none of which were wild turkey in the past, but they could be from other major places that you know and love. And then he gives those barrels, he basically resells them to bars and liquor stores, not different from how we sell our Russell's barrels to Eureka. So he does that. He partnered with David Jennings. And because David Jennings, aka Rarebird 101, is such a very close friend with the Russell family, he himself has exhibited his own dedication to wild turkey, not dissimilar to Jimmy Russell in a way. Like, this guy literally started writing about wild turkey for no money, for nothing. He doesn't work for wild turkey. He doesn't work for Campari. This guy's written hundreds of articles. He's actually written 2 books about wild turkey at this point, and all just for the love. So because of him and his relationship with us and Pablo and his business, they've created a brand called the Pride of Anderson County. Anderson County is where we are. Lawrenceburg is our city. Anderson is our county. And Anderson County historically is known for having a lot of distilleries over time. And really, if you had to say one whiskey was the pride of Anderson County, it would have to be Wild Turkey. Obviously, we're the longest running, one of the longest running. And these guys essentially created their own label, and we were able to offer them some barrels that they purchased, and they'll be releasing some bourbons and some ryes, I believe. I believe their barrels, they're all single barrels, and they're going to be in the 10 to 12-year-old range. They're all a little bit older, and they are barrel proof. So it is a lot of the stuff that the whiskey fanatics are asking for. They want to taste that whiskey how it would taste straight out of the barrel, which is barrel proof. It's single barrel, non-chill filtered. And in terms of wild turkey, what makes this extra special, it's not even our product to sell. So like we benefit off this very little, aside from just, reputation wise within the very small whiskey circles. This is not a Campari product. but it is Wild Turkey liquid. So that's what makes it super unique, is that we don't really sell our barrels to anybody else in this fashion. Yes, we'll sell our great partners like Eureka. We sell them tons of barrels to do cool stuff like this, but they're still Russell's barrels, right? They don't say just Eureka on them. In this case, they are able to say Pride of Anderson County, which is a completely different brand. So it's going to be a very, very limited offering. If you are a Wild Turkey fan, I would definitely try to get some of that. It is going to be special. It's going to be a different way to taste Wild Turkey than, you know, how we typically offer it. So
that's super cool. I wasn't even aware of it until today. And we've worked with Pablo for a few years now and done some rare character stuff. And
yeah,
so I'll keep my eye out for that. So I got one more question for you. I know we're a little over an hour here, so I appreciate your time.
No worries.
Mark Horowitz wants to know, with some people thinking older is better, what do you think the sweet spot is wise for age statements on bourbon, and what does Wild Turkey think?
Oh, I love that. That's a great question. I mean, that definitely, you know, kind of, I can tell Mark is a Wild Turkey fan. He might even know the answer to this. He's teeing me up. He's teeing me up. But you know, for me personally, I would probably agree with Jimmy Russell. If you ask Jimmy Russell, he'd probably say 8 years old, right? So, you know, when you put your spirit in the barrel, there's a few things happening to create that final product, right? You have got extraction of flavor. You've got oxidation or aeration of the spirit as the barrel kind of expands and contracts based on the climate. And then you have concentration and evaporation. So all that stuff happening to lead to your final product, right, takes time. So, you know, maybe you know, I know a lot of our viewers most of them are California and a couple other places, but I'm sure at this point we're all familiar with maybe a smaller independent distillery, and we've had a whiskey from them only at maybe 2, 3, or 4 years old, what I'd consider just a little bit young for bourbon. And when it is younger like that, you can still taste a lot of the grain character. And, you know, there's different things you can do in your process to make your whiskey taste better at a younger age. But for us, what we do in our process, how we make it and how we distill it, it needs time. So again, extraction, aeration, evaporation / concentration, all that happening at 2 to 4 years old, it's real green. Grain is still the dominant flavor. At 6 years old, you're getting some of the caramel, the vanilla, the spices coming in from the barrel, but you're not getting as much of, like, say, the fruity stuff. Apple, cherry, pear, orange peel, some of the things we've said tonight. But at 8 years old, it is like where the grain character is a little subdued, the sweet flavors from the barrel are extracted, and the fruity flavors have had time to evolve. So 8 years old is kind of my answer. I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. The Russells definitely, but I also love a good 10-year-old bourbon. I love when it is a little oakier, when it's got a little bit of like leatheriness, when it's got a little bit of savoriness. I think that's all really good and fine as well.
Awesome. All right, let's run through these questions really quick, and you tell me your 2 favorites, and I'll pick the 2 winners. So we got Clark White asked about your favorite Jimmy story. Brendan Franco asked about finishing techniques. Mike Stodinger asked about the difference between rare breed and Russells. We had the questions about prohibition from Mark Valpreda and Linda Archer. We had the rare character question. We had the question about treating your water.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had the question about your sweet spot for age statement. So thank you again to all our members for all your questions. I'm sorry we cannot get to everyone's questions. Try to get to as many as possible. But Benny, favorite 2 questions?
Right. So I kind of I'm going to go towards the ones that, might seem like a little more obvious, but they're important because they really reveal parts of our process that are important to us. So one of the questions I'm going to choose is the one we just did about the ages, because age is important in all whiskey. You can't just put this stuff in the barrel for a day and expect it to taste good. It takes time, but there are sweet spots. But to the point of the question, older doesn't mean better. So I do like that question. I like to kind of harp on the fact that older isn't better, and that 6 to 8 year old, right around 8 year old, really is such a good age for bourbon. And that is where a lot of our products fall, and that's not me trying to sell our stuff or a coincidence. It's just the fact of the matter, that we've been making bourbon for 80 years, just as Wild Turkey bourbon, and longer than that even. And knowing that good bourbon only has to be, a good bourbon can be 5 years old, right? 6, 7, 8 years old, though, is where bourbon really shines. So I really like that message. I really like to highlight that. And then the other one that jumped out at me was actually the rare breed versus Russell's question. And that's for the same reasons, right? Because we only use one mash bill, that question really, caught the fact that we make this whiskey one way. So what makes it different? What makes your products different? So I think that was a really important call out and moment for us to talk about that. So I think that question was really good. So that's going to be.
All right. All right. So I have the hard job of choosing first place and second place. I think I'm going to go with Mark Horowitz for first place for the question about the age statement, just because I feel like I agree. I feel like older bourbon is not necessarily always better. And then I'll go with Mike Stottinger for the second place. So Mark and Mike, we will reach out to you, letting you know what bottles will be coming your way. Thank you to Wild Turkey for getting you those bottles. And Benny, huge thank you for your time this evening and making that delicious cocktail and sharing all your knowledge. Hopefully we can do this again another year or so.
Absolutely. I'm always down. Thank you, Trevor. Thanks everybody for tuning in. I mean, my pleasure. So we'll do this again soon.
All right. Till next time. Cheers.
Cheers.